Chapter 12, Growth Spurt Doesn't Hurt. On Tuesday afternoon, Mr. Larson called the class to order. He wrote 3 words on the chalkboard from left to right: positive, neutral, negative. Mr. Larson said, "An editorial writer has only got a little bit of space, so every word has to be chosen for power." Tapping the board as he said the key words, Mr. Larson continued, The words a writer chooses can be positive, negative, or neutral. Is the writer building something up? That's positive writing. Tearing something apart? That calls for negative punches. And if the writer is just exploring, just looking all around an issue, that's a neutral treatment. Kara raised her hand. Mr. Larson said, "Question, Kara?" But if an editor is taking a negative position on something like war or drugs, wouldn't that really be positive? Mr. Larson said, yes and no. Yes, the effect might be positive, but the treatment, the words themselves, and the images they communicate, they would be negative. Now everyone look over the editorials you clipped. Let's get some lists going up here: positive, neutral, and negative. For 10 minutes, the kids peppered Mr. Larson with words and phrases, and he wrote them down as quickly as he could. The negative column filled up fastest with words like stupid, disgraceful, foolish, laughable, wasteful, outraged, idiotic, scandalous, uninformed, half-baked, and shamefully. Positive words and phrases included generously, public-spirited, wise, beneficial, commendable, carefully researched, useful, honorable, good. Neutral words or phrases were a lot harder to find. In fact, the kids only found 5: apparently, clearly, not certain, understandably, and presumably. Then Mr. Larson led a rousing class discussion, more like a shouting match, about which kind of editorial treatment was best. Everyone finally agreed that there were times and places for all 3 kinds. Reaching over to his desk, Mr. Larson grabbed a sheet of paper and taped it up onto the chalkboard. The class hushed. It was a copy of the Landry News. "I know You've all seen this new and improved edition of the Landry News," he said. "And I know from the condition of the room and my shrinking newspaper stack that you've all been looking at a lot of other newspapers too." Mr. Larson smiled. "So, give me some opinions. How is the Landry News different from the other papers you've been looking at? And how is it the same?" No one said anything. Come on now. We're not being negative here, we're being neutral. In fact, we have every reason to be very positive. Pointing at the newspaper, he said, "This is quite a big change to happen in 1 week. I'm not asking for comments about the paper. Just tell me, how is it similar to the other ones you've been reading, and how is it different?" Mr. Larson paused. "Who's got an idea? Ed? You must have an idea. Tell me a difference." Ed gulped. Glancing at Kara and Joey before he spoke, he said, "Size? Our paper, the Landry News, it doesn't have as many words." "Size. Excellent, Ed. Size." Mr. Larson wrote the word on the board. "Now someone else," said Mr. Larson. "Another difference. Leanne?" Leanne was ready. "Those other newspapers have hundreds of reporters and printers and stuff," she blurted out, "and this newspaper only has a few." That broke things open. In just a few minutes, there was a long list of differences. Things like advertisements, a purchase price, color pictures, comics, gossip columns, advice columns, world news. Then came the list of similarities. It covered all the basics. The Landry News had local news stories, it had reporters, it had writers, it had a black and white picture, it had an editorial, it had readers, and it was interesting, just like the other papers. Looking back and forth from list to list, Sharon raised her hand. Mr. Larson nodded at her. "Sharon?" She said, "Well, why couldn't the Landry News have more of those other things in it too, like columns and comics and stuff?" "That's a fair question," said Mr. Larson, "but I can't answer it. You all missed another similarity that the Landry News has to those other papers. The Landry News also has an editor-in-chief, and if you've got a question about changing the Landry News, you'd have to ask her." All eyes turned to Kara. She was sitting on a desk, one foot on the chair, the other leg crossed, her sharp little chin propped on her fist, with her elbow on her knee. She looked like that famous statue, the Thinker, but thin, with her brown plaid skirt covering her skinny knees and her ponytail flopped to one side. She could feel the color rising in her cheeks. Mr. Larson was asking her to make the decision. Kara Landry, the editor-in-chief. The first thought that flashed through her mind was how much fun it would be to tell her mom about all this at supper tonight. A lot had happened to Kara in the last 10 days. Less than 2 weeks ago, Kara Landry had been the invisible girl. Now every kid and every teacher in the school knew her name and her face. The Landry News used to be something Kara did completely on her own, something with a single voice and a single vision, an extension of her own thinking and her own two hands. To make the newspaper that Mr. Larson had taped up there on the chalkboard, Kara had needed the hands and eyes and ears of others. She had made new friends, and they had all worked and laughed, then argued and thought, and then laughed again. She had seen how good it made all of them feel to make the newspaper together. Kara didn't feel famous. What she felt was useful. She felt needed, and she liked it. And if just having 4 or 5 kids help with the paper could make it that much better and that much more fun, could it hurt to have the group get bigger? Kara straightened up and looked around. Then she smiled a warm, inclusive smile that made her whole face shine. And the editor-in-chief said, "If it's going to have more features, it's going to need more writers and reporters, more typists, more of everything. And it's going to need more writers, and it's not all that easy or fun. Just ask Leanne or Joey. So whoever wants to help, come back to my desk. The deadline for the next edition is this Friday, and it's a short week." The whole class followed Kara back to her desk in the corner, and soon Joey and Ed and Leanne were helping Kara figure out how to divide up the work. Left alone at the front of the room, Mr. Larson turned around and slowly pulled his copy of the Landry News off the chalkboard. Sitting at his desk, he carefully peeled off the piece of tape. Then he pulled open the deep drawer on the bottom left and took out a new file folder. With a green marker, he wrote the Landry News on the tab in neat block letters. He folded the newspaper sheet exactly in half, put it into the file folder, and tucked it into the drawer. By this time, the noise in room 145 had reached a level that would have stunned or possibly paralyzed any other teacher at Denton Elementary School. But Mr. Larson heaved a satisfied sigh, poured himself a cup of hot coffee from his big red thermos, smiled, leaned back in his chair, and opened up his other newspaper to the sports section. So he's got him working once again. We'll have to see what happens next. Bye.